Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our very special evening with the legendary Isabella Rossellini. I'm I'm James Wetzel. I'm the producer of adult programs at the Museum of Science, and I am thrilled to welcome everyone to tonight's continued conversation. We first brought Isabella and Brian together for a very special evening on site at the museum in the fall, and they had a great conversation about animal cognition and behavior and the wonders of nature. And they literally left our sold out audience wanting more. And they kept clamoring and asking us for more. And over the past couple of months, we have had to pivot our team and figure out new ways of engaging our adult audiences through our virtual platforms. And this duo and this conversation was one that we kept coming back to. And so when we reached out to Isabella and Brian, we were thrilled that they agreed to reunite for one night only and allow us to bring this conversation into all of your homes tonight. And they are both incredible experts in the field and just fantastic communicators of science. And they have a really special evening in store for all of us. And tonight is a part of our virtual season of adult programming, which is a part of our MOSatHome initiative. We have turned the Museum of Science into a virtual museum, offering free STEM-related content on a daily basis across our digital platforms. And as a part of that, we have launched our Subspace Adult Programs After Dark channel to host tonight's program, as well as the rest of our upcoming lineup. We have some fantastic programming still to come, still to even be announced, all free, all virtual, and all for adults ages 18 plus. So we hope that you'll check out that full schedule and come back and join us after dark. I will be back a little bit later on tonight for a Q&A with Isabella and Brian. So if you do have questions for them throughout the program, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen if you're watching through Zoom with us. And we will try and get through as many of those as we possibly can a little bit later on. I need to thank our friends from the Lowell Institute for their continued support of the adult programming at the museum. Without them, we would not be here tonight. This event would not be happening, and it would not be free. So please join me in giving a huge virtual round of applause to the Lowell Institute. And finally, if you enjoy yourself tonight, I ask that you go after the talk to mos.org/science matters and show your support for MOSatHome and allow us to keep bringing programming like this into your homes. Once again, that's mos.org/science matters. And now I'm so honored to welcome to the Zoom our special guest this evening. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Brian Hare and the legendary one and only Isabella Rossellini. Take it away, you two.
I am so pleased to be able to spend an hour with you talking about your new book that is about to come out, that is called The Survival of the Friendliest. Of course, the title is it's based on the saying that a lot of people say about evolution, which is the survival of the fittest. It's always the strongest, most clever that evolves and takes over. But here tonight, we're talking about another strategy, the friendliest. And this book was going to be published by the very prestigious Random. It'll come out in July. But Brian sent me a copy, and I would like to talk about it because since I was a little girl, I always loved animals. I always had dogs, chickens, domestic animal, and I always wondered if they shared my emotion. It seemed to me that they did. If there was any cognitive ability, even to their different degree than I wanted to be, of course, more intelligent than them. But all these questions I've always had since I was a little girl. Now, this book that you have written discusses the process of domestication, and it takes it a step further, self-domestication, which is what you are proposing first. What I learned at university, and I keep reading in books that I read, is that the domestication is a man-driven process. Our ancestors, without understanding evolution, they knew that their children looked like them, and they knew that their animals, the babies of the animal had the same markings or something. So just having that information, they started to select the animal that they liked the most. That's how of course, all the domestic animal come from wild one. We know that the great-great-great-great-great-grandfather of the boar evolved, was domesticated to become our domestic pig. And I have a little drawing that I've made about it. We know that the great-great-great, that is the boar on top, and that is the domestic pig. We know that the great-great-great-great-great-father of the Uruk cow became our domestic cow. And James should bring that, my drawing of the cow. And then, of course, we know that the Asian red jungle fowl was domesticated to become our common chickens. So I imagine that our ancestor captured wild animals and selected through the century the one they liked the most. And I assume that they liked the most the one that were calmer, easier to handle, that could tolerate living together in a corral. And little by little, they changed this animal that was domesticated. In science, we make a difference between a wild animal, a tamed animal, that is an animal that has lost its fear of men, and to a domesticated. Domesticated is when they change so much that we feel obliged to give it another name. And this is how the wolf has become the dog. Now, as I said before I read The Genius of Dog, Brian's first book, and now this second book, I've always imagined that domestication was man-driven. And I've made a film about how the wolf becomes the dog. So I'm going to show it to you, but then I want to discuss with Brian his new information that is missing in my film. Here is the video. Now we're back, and I would like to ask Brian, what you added to this domestication and what you mean by self-domestication?
Thank you, Isabella. And I have to say that that video brilliantly captures almost 99% of everything perfectly correct still today. There's just a subtle change that's happened, and that is the part where you say that man controlled the mating. I think now a lot of scientists think that actually it was the friendly wolves that preferred or were selecting to mate with other friendly wolves. But they did that on their own, and that's why we think of it as self-domestication. And one of the first hints that led us to this is the fact that that date you gave of 15,000 years ago, that means that all humans, and we know from genetic evidence that all humans, we know from genetic evidence that that's when dogs started to be domesticated for wolves. And we know at that time that all humans were foragers. So there was the first seed had never been sown. And so that means that wolves were domesticated by people who were living without agriculture. So that presents three problems.
Because all the other animals, the domestication of the pig, the cow, the chicken, they happened around 8,000 years ago with the advent of agriculture. Men understood that you could select its seed and make a wild asparagus into a bigger, sweeter asparagus, the domestic asparagus, and applied the same principle to animals. But dog was domesticated 15,000 years earlier.
That's right, at least. And in fact, some of the estimates are the domestication of dogs began 40,000 years ago. So somewhere between 15 and 40,000 years ago. And so that presents some problems, because it ends up that as humans pulsed out of Africa around 50 to 60,000 years ago, one of their main competitors in the carnivore guild was the wolf. And so humans were directly competing with wolves. And so if you were going to take wolf puppies, bring them home and raise them and have them as adults in
might have eaten you.
They might have eaten your children.
The primitive men.
That's right. That's right. And so you'd have to feed them 10 pounds of meat per day, potentially. You'd have to leave them when you go to forage and hunt with your kids at home. And then domestication. Yeah, right. And as you said about domestication, it's different than taming an animal. You can tame a wild animal. An individual animal that's from the wild can be tamed during its lifetime. But to domesticate, you have to cause genetic change over many generations. And so that would mean that foragers who were busy just trying to forage were somehow controlling the mating of adult wolves for generations. It seems unlikely. So if you put up, James, the picture of a little canid here, I think this little guy is what led us to what we think the solution to that problem is. So this is a fox that has been under selection for friendliness. So this is a fox that was selected for, it's from a population of foxes that was selected for many generations based on one criteria. And that criteria was, that's right. So they've, in this population, the scientists only bred the friendliest foxes with the other friendly foxes. And they measured friendliness based on, did they want to be friendly to humans and be with humans and interact and play and not bite? And so they did that for 50 generations, and this fox is a product of that selection. One of the surprises was that they selected for friendliness, but it was their behavior that changed. It was also their minds and their bodies. And so that's why this fox looks so different. So we think that this is the first hint that just a simple mating of different individuals who are friendly together can cause friendlier individuals, but it can, all the changes we think of related to domestication.
I also have a drawing. I'm making a drawing of all the domestic animals, cows, rabbits, cats, dog, even mice, and they all have patchiness. Patchiness, black and white and brown patches, this is a sign of domestication. And after reading your book, and was continued all the way to you in your PhD studies, I made I mean, we are in quarantine, so I cannot work with my crew, but I made the beginning of a hope to become an animation. So let me show you what I did. The fox video, so you'll see, I see myself as an environmental artist. I take science is my muse, and I try to translate what I learn into fun and entertaining things. But the basic information, it's always correct. So here is my first attempt to animation on the fox. So Brian, I still am trying to figure out how to illustrate the inside, the brain, the hormone, and continue to tell the story. But you can tell us again, just with words, because the inside changes are what dictate the outside changes.
First of all, I love that video. It is just brilliant. I can't believe you did that from home, just drawing. I mean, it's just genius. So you're right. Things did change in the inside. And I think the way to think about it, and it's not too complicated, the genetics changed because of this biological selection that happened. So their genes changed. And we think it's genetics involved in their development, such that when the foxes grew older, they maintained a juvenile-like aggressiveness. So in fact, they didn't have very much aggressiveness at all because they were sort of like puppies into their adulthood. And the other thing that happened inside them was their psychology changed. Because they were more like puppies as adults, they still sort of had puppy-like behavior as an adult. They're much better at communicating and cooperating even with humans. And that was the discovery I made. I got to go to Siberia and work with the foxes. And I was the first actually person. I was doing my PhD and I was the first person to get to work with them who wasn't Russian. And everybody was surprised, including me, that they were better at understanding when you gesture to them. They understand people like dogs do, even though the Russians never selected for that. So those are some of the things that change inside. Their genes, their hormones that are involved in aggression, and their psychology.
They change also because friendliness dictates the need, dictates the need to cooperate, to understand, to communicate. And so genetically they become more propense to that. Is that propense is a word? Maybe it's an Italian word, more inclined to that.
Yes, that's exactly right. So what happened is, instead of being afraid of people, for instance, now they are attracted to people. In fact, it's adorable because when you go to we haven't emphasized yet that they did keep a control line, and the control line they bred random to how they interacted with humans. And the control line didn't change basically from the beginning. They don't have curly tails and floppy ears at the same rate that the experimental population has. And it's adorable because when you go to the experimental population, they all just desperately want you to pick them up and hug them, and they wag their tails, and they have these little barks that are like puppy-like barks that they even use as an adult. They've really been juvenilized in a way that the control wolves have not. And so that juvenile curiosity and wanting to interact and be friendly then allows them to solve problems with people that the control population, they just want to run away.
But the juvenile doesn't mean stupider. It's more stupid.
No.
It means the opposite. And in fact, you've studied also the comparison between chimpanzees and bonobos. And bonobos were only recognized as a different species than chimpanzee. They look very much like chimpanzee only, I don't know, 40, 50 years ago. But they were, I remember reading sometimes there is a genius chimpanzee at the zoo. And then they discovered later on that it was a bonobo because he was more capable of understanding communication. He was friendlier.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and so I mean, back to thinking about the dogs and the wolves, the foxes tell us that actually domestication can happen in nature without humans, because there are many examples potentially. We have many candidates of species that have been selected in nature to be friendlier. And so all we need to do is go into nature and look at some of these candidates and see if you not only see friendlier species, but some of the byproducts, some of these things like that are the equivalent of curly tails or floppy ears. And so we had one of the candidates, and if we could put the slide up, one of the first candidates that we wanted to look at, and this was with Richard Wrangham, who just retired from Harvard. The animal on, I believe, on the left of your screen, I believe on the left is a bonobo, so the darker image here. And then the pinker faced individual, that's a chimpanzee. So they look really similar, but these two species couldn't be more different because chimpanzees are famous because they kill and coerce. No bonobo has ever been observed to kill another bonobo, and bonobos never coerce one another. But they also have had changes in their mind and in their behavior. So some of the things that we've discovered is once we realized that, hey, if these guys are so much friendlier, the bonobos, because they don't kill or coerce, maybe they're an example where their minds and their bodies have also changed in a way that dogs have if you compare them to chimpanzees. So I can tell you a little bit about that too.
I don't think I've ever seen a bonobo. I've seen chimpanzees in zoos, but I've never seen them in the wild, nor I've seen a bonobo. And you conduct your study in Congo because they live in Congo.
Yes.
And so to my understanding is that once, long time ago, there was one species. And then there was something, maybe an earthquake or something that happened, and the Congo River divided the land and divided the population of this great-great-great-great-grandfather of the chimpanzees and the bonobos. And so they started to, what in science they call speciation, they started to look differently because they followed different society rule or different ways of solving how to eat, how to raise their babies. And that's why they have these two different behavior. I mean, we can't call it tradition, but completely different behavior. And the bonobos are known as the hippies of the, they solve everything with lovemaking, don't they?
They do. They do. And that's what they're most famous for. It is, I think, part of the evidence that they are self-domesticated. But what we found when we went to look and said, hey, can we look at the foxes and dogs and the comparison to the control foxes and chimpanzees to bonobos, and can we look and see any analogous changes? And we did. We saw them. So, for instance, bonobo males, they have a juvenilized body form. So they never reach a body form that is like a fully adult chimpanzee, even though they're kind of the same size. When we measure the shape of their face and their skull actually maintains almost an infant-like shape, and they have actually slightly smaller brains. They also have some neurobiology that is much more like a dog than a wolf. So those are some of the body changes that happen. They also have, in terms of their pigment, they have pink lips. They lost the pigment on their lips. And they have a white tail tuft, so they've lost the pigment on their tails too. They have short little, it's not a tail like a monkey, it's just a short little patch of fuzz on their rear ends, basically. And they're white even as adults, whereas chimps, they lose that white. So that's their body. And then in terms of their mind, they are attracted to strangers. Now that is a shock because chimpanzees are very xenophobic because they kill and coerce. Chimpanzees will even kill their neighbors. They kill infants in their own group sometimes. They'll kill infants in neighboring groups. None of that happens in bonobos. And we think partly because of that, bonobos actually are interested and attracted to strangers. They love new bonobos. And so their body and their mind has changed.
But tell me, so the bonobos, how do they solve everything? By what? Kissing, hugging, and for example, how do they? Is there a difference in the mating strategies? The male chimpanzee, I think the female chimpanzee wants to mate all the male. Becomes incredibly promiscuous, with, because she wants to confuse, we think, yes. Who is the father of the babies. Because if one male chimpanzee finds a female that he has not mated with, he might kill that baby so that he can have, all these. That is one of the you never see that behavior in bonobos. Isn't it? They all make love to each other anyway, and also same-sex love.
So what you just told is the perfect story, but in the last 2 years, there's been a new discovery about bonobos. And in fact, there was a paper published last week from a new researcher at Harvard who's studying bonobos, who has further evidence that what I'm going to tell you is true. Which is, it is absolutely true that chimpanzee males coerce females into mating, and that females try to confuse them about paternity. In bonobos, that's never been observed. A male who tries to coerce a female isn't gonna do very well because bonobos are famous for female bonobos working together. So the reason that they don't kill and they don't coerce, males aren't able to coerce females, is because even though they're unrelated and they're not sisters, they're not cousins, they're unrelated to each other, females stick together, and if they see one female in their group being coerced or aggressed against by a male, they all intercede on her behalf. And in fact, if there's a strange new female who enters the group, they are most protective of her, which is the opposite in chimpanzees. The female chimpanzees would attack the new female trying to come into the group. So not only is there that going on, but about how they decide who's going to mate, the new discovery is that it's actually twofold. One's an amazing surprise, and the other is the answer to the puzzle. The surprise is that when it was measured, what species has the most successful males? So meaning the most successful male and having the most babies. Well, you would think that a big alpha chimpanzee who can beat everybody up and mate and coerce would be number one. Well, it ends up, it's absolutely not true. The most successful male between the two species are bonobo males. So bonobo males are far more successful at having more offspring with more females than chimpanzees. Now, how could that be? Doesn't make sense. The male bonobos are so nice and they're not coercing, they're not killing. How could they have more babies? That doesn't make any sense at all. The reason is because, and this is the new finding, their moms make sure they're successful. So their mothers introduce their sons to their best friends and all their girlfriends. And the moms who are best and have the biggest friendship network have the sons that everyone prefers to mate with, and they have the most offspring.
So it's again another example of the survival of the friendliest. It even is reflected in the family and the behavior of a group within the bonobos. A female that is friendlier would have a son, everybody would want to be the father of the babies.
Yes, so the friendliest mom has the most successful son.
And this happened as self-domestication. Bonobos live in a very remote part of Congo that is very difficult. I know that the studies in the wild are very difficult because they are very remote. And yet, why was it a difference? Did they have different sorts of food? How come there was this resolving their social problems so differently? Do we know, or we have a clue of how could have happened?
Well, you hinted at it earlier, because I think you know, is that north of the Congo River, it's chimpanzee land, and south of the Congo River, it's bonobo land. And one of the ideas is that bonobos evolved, first it's important to say that apes can't swim. So just like we have to learn to swim, bonobos and chimpanzees have to learn to swim. That's not true for monkeys or lemurs or most other mammals, but apes sink, they don't swim. So if you have a river between you, then that's a great speciation barrier. And so south of the Congo River, it is thought that gorillas were absent. So gorillas live together with chimpanzees, and what do gorillas do? Well, they eat all the food that chimpanzees rely on when things get bad. So in bonobo land, when things got bad and there wasn't a lot of food available, well, there were no gorillas eating the sort of stuff that you would go dig deep into your cabinet. Maybe it's the tuna or the Spam, I don't know. And it's still there. And so in chimp land, that's not there. So why does that matter? Well, it matters a lot, because if you're in chimpanzee land north of the Congo River and things are bad, you can't be with your female friends because you're competing for the little bit of food that's available. South of the Congo River, you can be with your female friends all the time, because even in the worst of times, there's still enough food for everybody. Females form bonds and really strong friendships, and they can defend themselves against the males.
You know, I did a field study at Hunter College when I studied animal behavior, and it was in the Bahamas, and we went and studied dolphin. Diana Reese was my teacher, and she studies dolphin communication. And I just read your book, The Genius of Dogs, where you already talk about self-domestication. And these dolphins in the Bahamas, they recognized the different boats. They would run away, swim away if a fishing boat would come that they feared. But another fishing boat would come and they would cooperate with the fishermen. They would find school of fish and push it toward the nets. And they liked our boat because they liked to bow ride, and they were curious about us. Sometimes we just stopped the boat and they would come and just stood there around us. And then some of us sometimes went in the water and swam with them. And I read, you know, I thought of your book and I thought of the wolf. And I said, here is a wild animal that is not aggressive, we can swim with. He seems like he wants to communicate with us. You could tell that maybe like the wolf and the first hunter, our primitive men went hunting and the wolf followed and helped because they were after the same prey. And that happened also with the dolphin. There they were helping fishermen. If the fishermen will give them, if they weren't aggressive with them, we will let them have some fish. Immediately you start a friendship. And I made a film, and I'd like to show you a video. I didn't make anything specifically about domestication or self-domestication, because I'm learning about it now. But this video was done in a series called Seduce Me, about the different strategies that animals have for seduction. And one of the things that is important for a candidate for domestication, men control, or especially men controlled, is promiscuity, because of course we would pick who they would mate with. And I thought that even in that, the dolphin has it, because the dolphin is known to be very loving, let's say. So here's the video about the dolphin. That's my video about dolphins. So
anything goes.
Is non-reproductive sex seen in the wilderness? And it could be used, I mean, can you have another function, sex, than just reproduction?
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, that's the most brilliant science communication possible. I just want to say that. My gosh. Anyway, so the non-reproductive sex is common in the natural world. I think it's one of these things that allows for friendliness and social bonding in a lot of different species, I think including dolphins there, and bonobos. If you, James, put up the picture of the two little orphans from Lola, I can tell you the story of bonobos and their sexual behavior. This is two bonobos, two young females, and they're actually frottaging. They're rubbing their clitorises together, and they are at the sanctuary Lola Ya Bonobo, where they're given lifetime care. But the reason I tell you that they're at a sanctuary is because it's an unusual situation that allows us to understand their sexual behavior in a way we couldn't otherwise. So they're in a group of peers only. They're in a group of 3 to 5 year old bonobo orphans, and there are no adults. And they, as you can see, anything goes. We like to say that bonobos are trisexual, that they'll try anything sexual. And they have the imagination that dolphins have, that you saw in Isabella's video. And one of the things these orphans show us is that the sexual behavior is not something they learn. It's really something it's inborn. We see the rubbing of genitals between all different pairings, even when they're 6 months of age. And in contrast, chimpanzees only show reproductive sexual behavior and a little bit of non-reproductive sexual behavior once they reach adolescence, or once they're adults, they really have a relatively boring sex life compared to bonobos. They mostly will have intercourse if it's for reproduction. Bonobos, they play, have sex. I mean, they greet with genital rubbing, basically. So they use this to bond, to reduce tension, to negotiate. And females are particularly successful at using their sociosexual, non-reproductive behavior to make sure that males do not get out of hand, or as the Congolese like to say, that the males don't need to be corrected by an alliance of females. They try to keep them distracted this way.
Now, Brian, of course, that can be said about us too, human being. You know, me personally, I have 2 children. I didn't just make my life twice or 4 times the attempt to have them. And it is a bonding experience for me too. So there is a link or a continuum, maybe. Maybe there is even on that. But I wanted to ask you, if we domesticated animal and animal self-domesticated, have animal domesticated us? Because we all evolved together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in that, thinking about self-domestication, and that animals, like for instance, bonobos, what we think, the very specific thing we think happened is that female bonobos, because they could form alliances, they had enough resources where they could bond, they no longer had to put up with male aggression. And so they not only could defend themselves, but they could choose who to mate with. And they have a huge preference to mate with the friendliest males that are the sons of their best friends. And when they no longer are bullied by the males, like in chimpanzees, they express that preference. And the kindest, friendliest males have the most offspring. And we know that male bonobos who are bullies do very poorly in reproduction. So that's the first thing. And so once you have self-domestication, going back to dogs, the idea is that, like the foxes, dogs evolve from wolves as wolves are hanging around humans, and friendly wolves are choosing to mate together, and you have the whole fox process happen. But that's not to say that then much later, humans then intentionally domesticated further. And that's, of course, how you have all the different dog breeds. And we think, as in the example you said, after there's agriculture, probably there were many animals that were directly, intentionally bred. But your question was, what about animals impacting us? And that is one of the topics we take up in the book is, are humans self-domesticated? And one idea that people have argued for is that dogs, after they evolve, they allow us to have more resources, to be more, have bigger alliances, and so we can be friendlier ourselves. So there is absolutely the possibility that dogs had a role in shaping us.
And do you see the same changes? I mean, we don't have patchiness, and the ears are not like this, they're not floppy, but our skulls are smaller, for example, than our ancestor, although we probably believe that we are more intelligent, of course. But isn't our skull smaller, as it is the wolf would have a bigger skull than a dog, and a wild fox will have a bigger skull than a domestic fox? Is that something that you see, or even in the bonobos, do you see also a smaller skull? Do you see a smaller skull? Do you ask, can a smaller skull, doesn't mean to be more stupid, but maybe it's a consequences of friendliness.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting what you say about the shrinking of the brain and the skull. It is a near universal signature of domestication, that domesticated animals tend to have a slightly smaller brain, 10–15% smaller, and the skull is also smaller. We know what the mechanism is. It actually is an increase in serotonin. This is sort of that feel-good hormone that reduces aggression and anxiety at the same time. And developmentally, if you're exposed to a lot of serotonin, you tend to have a little bit smaller of a brain and a rounder brain, a rounder skull. And we see that in humans too. And so the question is, we clearly have a rounder skull than other close human relatives that are now extinct, like Neanderthals. But what about a smaller skull? Well, I've been involved in some research, and others have done research to look at the last 50,000 years. It does end up that the human brain, as big as it is shrinking by a few percentages. Yes, we have slightly smaller brains than humans that lived 50 to 80,000 years ago.
Do you have an image of the different skulls that we can see? How the skulls of our ancestor, archaic and domesticated. Oh yes, it's a complete comparison with the wolf as well.
Mm-hmm. So on the, what I hope is our audience is left, you can see the archaic, and then that's a wolf skull, and then to the right is a human, and then underneath that is a dog. And so what we've done is we've used the change between wolf and dog and chimpanzee and bonobo as an analogy to examine ideas of what may have happened late in human evolution we talk about in the book. because it's actually kind of a puzzle. Because that archaic human had culture. It had a big brain as big or bigger than our own. And those are usually the explanations we have for why we are the way we are. Oh, we have culture, we have language, we have a big brain. Well, they almost certainly had all of those things to some degree, yet here we are and they're not. And so we think, and we make the argument that late in human evolution, and maybe dogs had a small role, we also underwent self-domestication, and we have many of the features that you would predict based on our comparisons of other animals.
You know, since I was a little girl, I always wondered if my dog could understand me. And now I run a little organic farm, and I have lots of different animals. And this is completely non-scientific, but I feel the bond to dogs stronger than the bonds to my goats or the sheep and I always thought, well, maybe it's this thousands of years, 15,000 a year or 40,000 years. We don't know. The first dogs that we found in the remains of in villages of primitive men, you start seeing bones of dogs that live with them, and the dogs was having different skulls than the wolf. I sometimes feel this long history, but I wanted to show you my dog. I wonder, now the light is, because it's come night, because my dog yesterday, feeling still wilderness, climbed a tree fell, didn't completely fall halfway because of the storm. And we went to my farm, and he saw a squirrel going up that tree. He went up that tree that was like this, and then fell and broke a leg. Let me see if I can.
I'm so sorry. Oh, you sweet thing. Oh my goodness. Poor thing. Oh, feel better.
Oh, Sarah, I hit the wrong button. I say my dog has all the signs, classical sign of domestication: floppy ears, patchiness, curly tail.
and some juvenile curiosity. Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry about the fall there. Wow.
You have dogs, Brian? Like, I'm sure a lot of people are following.
I do. I have a dog, and he's a retired service dog, but he's upstairs with the kids right now, keeping them happy. And I run the Duke Canine Cognition Center, and we study dog psychology. And one of the things we do is we try to understand how dogs think and how they solve problems and how they can't solve problems, to help identify the best service dogs and how we can increase the number of dogs that can help people, whether it's mental disabilities or detecting things, whether it's bombs or whatever else it is. So that's one of the things we do is trying to understand how dogs' minds work.
For many years for the Guide Dog Foundation, raising dog mostly to help people that lost their sight. They're mostly Labrador and Golden Retriever, and I raised about 10 dogs, and 6 of them were able to become service dogs.
Wow.
Yes, generally there is a percentage of 50%, 60% could make it. And of course, we rely on your science to see what are the earliest cue, and breeding, selecting. These animals are, you control who they are mating with, because they have to be friendly. They love what they're doing. They love to guide. I've noticed that my puppies, I have them at the beginning I keep them for a year, and then they go to a more experienced handler than I. And I did notice that the guide dog, they always looked, when we walked, first of all, you had to let them walk a little bit ahead of you, because they had to guide the person. So you don't say heel, as you would say to another dog that would follow you without pushing on the leash. You want a guide dog to pull on the leash a little bit, because you have to follow. And but they love it. And I remember that when they were puppy, they always looked back to make sure that I was following them. I think they feel like they are the leader. I raised 10 of them, 6 of them make it. And then I had a back operation. And so puppies, you know, sometimes they pull too much. And so I had to stop that volunteering. And they sent me mama's dog. That was even better though. They sent me mama's dog 2 weeks before they gave birth to the puppy.
Oh.
And then I kept the puppies for the first 5 weeks because they don't want the puppies to be born in a kennel. The earliest experience, even at the beginning of being in a house, hearing the phone, the television, door slamming, children coming, socializes these dogs. So I often whelped, say, mama dogs, and that's my favorite one. And I hope to start again as soon as the COVID is under control to raise puppies for the Guide Dog Foundation.
That is wonderful. That is a great organization.
Yeah, sorry?
I said that is a great organization.
Yeah, it is. It is a wonderful organization. So I think we're ready to take some of the question of the audience, if there is any.
Wonderful. Well, first
I think
off,
we have James
Brian,
to help us.
yeah, and Isabella, thank you both so much. I know everyone out there, I can tell by the reaction in the Q&A, people are loving this. So many comments about how fascinating this is, and well wishes for your dog, Isabella. I think the first question we have is, can we talk a little bit, how did we get so many types of dogs? People want to know.
So it's actually interesting. Most breeds, most European dog breeds are less than 150 years old. If we were to travel back in time 200 years ago, before sort of the height of the Victorian era, there would have been maybe a few dozen dog breeds. Most of the oldest dog breeds are from Asia that are still alive. It seems that there were Native American dog breeds, but unfortunately they were all eradicated during colonization. So there's a really interesting history to the origin of dog breeds. And so really the reason we have so many dog breeds is because in the Victorian age, it became quite a thing to be able to say, I have this breed or that breed, and I'm so amazing that I was able to breed.
I think the breeds are, first there were our primitive, when the wolf has self-domesticated, and then probably men at a certain point started to domesticate because he started, that friendly wolf, he started to like one that maybe hunted very well with him. And so he said, well, if I can have his puppies, they might have the same talent. And so at a certain point, there were, I think 200 years ago, basically few breeds and talent. They selected for talent. So some dogs were guard dogs, some dogs were hunting dogs, some dogs were herding dogs. And then around in the Victorian time, it became this fashion. And in fact, Darwin starts his Origin of Species with another way to manipulate what they didn't know yet, evolution, and it's pigeon breeding, the fancies they are called, and they make pigeons with feathers like this and feathers like that, long tail, short tail, big collar, and they did the same thing with dogs, and that's why nowadays we have many, many dogs. I think it's deceiving to call them pure dogs, pure breeds, because it means something pure and the other are impure, but in fact is you reduce the genetic sources. So sometimes dogs that are purebred could have a lot of genetic problems.
Thank you. And this question's throwing it back to the fox video, which they loved the animation. They're curious as to why the litters would become bigger. Is that perhaps because the kinder foxes were potentially able to be better at nurturing? So is there some sort of evolutionary reaction at play?
Do you want me to take that, Isabella?
Yes.
The one idea that seems reasonable. That idea. Another idea is just reduce in stress hormones. So one of the things you have this, the foxes actually have 5 times the level of serotonin in their brains. That's a lot of serotonin. They're very happy foxes. Let's put it that way. They also have a major reduction in the corticosteroids. That's the stress hormones. And so when you have less stress, you can, basically your reproductive system is able to be more successful.
Great. And have there been any behavior studies that have mixed chimps and bonobos or wild foxes and domesticated foxes? So for example, a chimp being raised with bonobos or a wild fox with domesticated foxes?
I understand why you're asking that. It's a very good question, and the short answer is no. But I understand you want to by cross fostering, you'd like to understand the biological versus the non-biological components of rearing and socialization, et cetera. So I can tell you that in the case of bonobos and chimps, number one, we wouldn't want to do that because they're highly endangered. There's not many. And two is we do know based on comparisons of their physiology that the two organisms are very, very different. And based on genetic comparisons, we also know they're very different. Just one example of the physiology, when you put a chimpanzee male in a stressful social situation, their testosterone goes up and they get prepared to potentially compete. Bonobos, their testosterone doesn't do anything and their cortisol goes up, their stress hormone. And they get really stressed if there's a social anxious moment and all they want to do is hug. And so they have a completely different physiological response to the exact same social pressure.
I would like to add that when we talk about speciation, it's almost like we, human beings, at a certain point, the wolf starts to look so different that we say we have to call it something else, and we call it the dog. But wolf and dog could mate and have puppies. They have to be raised together. Culturally, if you take a dog and you leave it in Yellowstone parks, the wolf would kill it. But if they would be raised together and so tame to each other, they could still mate and reproduce. And then as they differentiate more and more and more, then they cannot reproduce anymore. It's fascinating to me, for example, the mule, which I always forgot who's the father, the father, the mule is sterile, and he has, I think, a mother who is a horse and a father who is a donkey, or the other way around. And they can produce an animal, the mule, which has been used in agriculture because he is stronger, he has qualities, temperament that were used by men in agriculture, but he's sterile because he's starting to have genetic defects because the donkey and the horses are so apart. So that mule, if it were to live in the wild, that population will never take because they are sterile. So they only exist because we combine the donkeys and the horses.
Fascinating. And this next question is very timely. I understand that dogs can smell some cancers and medical conditions. Will you be able to train dogs to smell coronavirus?
Thank you for that question. Just like everything with this virus, I don't know. But I will tell you that not our research group, but there's a group at Auburn. There's also a group at University of Pennsylvania. And there's a couple other groups in the United States working on exactly that question. We do know that dogs have the ability to distinguish between very closely related viruses based on olfactory information. They're volatile organic chemicals that are communicated into the environment that they can pick up on when you have a viral infection, even a very closely related virus. So it is suspected that they will be able to detect the virus by olfaction. Our research group, if that does prove out, our research group will jump in, and our role is to enhance the identification of the dogs that will be trainable.
Wow, they really are our best friends. And so we do have some cat lovers in here as well. Can we talk about how cats became domesticated?
Isabella, you want to take that one?
Well, I know less about cats because the dog and the fox experiment in Russia was so fascinating and it has been lasted for so long. To my understanding, some animals have to change a lot. The wolf was aggressive, predator, and it had to become a dog to be living with us. The cat, yes, he's a predator, but he always lived with us. And in fact, you know, they still today, they're pretty independent. And I think men let them live. They would, you know, during the time of early agriculture, there they were with the grains and they were killing all the mice. And so men tolerated them, and they were smaller than the wolf, the dog wolf. And so there was a living together. We tolerated each other much more. So I don't know that the primitive cat is that different from the today cat. Brian, you might know that. I know that the cat, for example, the mummy cat that you find in the pyramids is not that different, and is about 4,000 years ago. It's not that different from the today's cat.
I am not a cat expert either, but many of the ideas that we talked about in terms of what happens due to self-domestication, there are traits that map nicely with when you compare wild cats to our own Tabby's domesticated cats. Now the question, or I guess the thought, is that there hasn't been as much of a shift away from that wild type, but it has happened. And cats, and remember, when it's survival of the friendliest and we're talking about a species got friendlier, it's always compared to what? And so and the comparison is always to the ancestor or progenitor that led to the domesticated animal. So I would say, yes, cats are friendlier than a wild cat that you would not want to raise in your home.
Sometimes when I think of cat domestication, I also think of horse domestication, because wild horses and the domestic horses, they haven't changed that much physically as the wolf to the dog. So there is all degrees of how to change that animal to become domesticated.
Great. And so we know that dogs can understand simple commands, but can they comprehend complex language?
Well, I'm going to give that to Isabella because you have the most brilliant dog sitting there with you.
Well, the guide dog, they learn about 100 commands easily. They remember. I mean, I had a story of Stephen, a gentleman who lost his sight, wanted to go to Las Vegas and took the dog that I raised, Jojo, with him. Actually, there were 3 blind men that went to Las Vegas, and they lived in North Carolina, so they had a home. And there were an elevator, but Jojo, the dog, was raised by me in New York City. And so every time I would get in the elevator, I say the word elevator, as I would say door, so that he would get to the door. I would say key. And you repeat that every day, find the key. You, instead of hiding their ball, you hide the key, you hide the gloves, and they go search for it. And so that's how you teach them, by playing. But every time I went to my building, I said, let's get in the elevator, get in the elevator. Then, you know, Jojo went and lived in North Carolina, where there was no need for the elevator until they went to Las Vegas. And the slot machine made the same cling sound at the elevator, and the 3 men, they said, oh, with all these different sound, we can't hear where the elevator is. Where do we go? And Stephen said, maybe Jojo remembers because he grew up in New York with Isabella. And he said, Jojo, find the elevator. And Jojo took them, all 3 of them, to the elevator right away. But also, besides knowing so well commands and understanding words, I know there's something else that they understand. They pay attention to the minimal things, or maybe smell or heartbeats. You know, they have different earrings. Because sometimes I'm studying and then I think, okay, let's get up and take a walk with the dog. And before I get up on my desk, the dog is already at the door looking at his leash. So it's not telepathy. Do I exude a different smell? Do I do something that I'm not aware of that he can read right away? So there is not only communication in sophisticated language, it's a lot of body language that they read.
And is there like a communication system between dogs as well? Was another question we got. Like, do they communicate with each other?
Oh, sure. I'm sure, Brian, you would know better. I'm sure they do. My dogs they have friends. I know that they have enemies, and we always have to be careful. Pinocchio here is my dog, is very afraid of another dog called Oliver, but he's very friendly with Coco, and they play. And so yes, they have friendships, and when they see each other, they go through a ritual of wagging tail, and they do. Yes, I mean, you see a lot of dogs, Brian, more than I, so you would know that they communicate to one another.
All I need to do is say I completely agree with everything you said, and said in a more interesting way than I ever could.
Great. And going back to the foxes, do we know why the more domesticated fox individuals develop white patches? What is the evolutionary advantage in that?
Would you like me to answer that one?
Yes.
Okay. So what's been discovered and hypothesized is that when you select for friendliness and you juvenilize an animal, and we sort of mentioned this before, you change the genetics, but you change specific genes. You change genes that are important for very early development of the hormonal system that is in control of aggression. And when you change that hormonal system, you have to change the development by accident of a whole bunch of other stuff. There's sort of a downstream effect. If you alter one set of genes that reduces a set of hormones involved in aggression, well, by accident, you change a whole bunch of other stuff. And one of the things you change are the cells that lead to pigmentation. They're hormones that are involved in driving the appearance of different pigments. And of course, a white spot is the lack of pigmentation. So what's thought is that there's a set of cells called neural crest cells, and they migrate throughout the body. They're involved in the development of places in the brain that are involved with aggression and the hormones that modulate that aggression. But they're also those same cells. They have fancy things like they're pluripotent, meaning they can do many different jobs in the body. If you change those cells to change the hormone configuration, well, you also change how they migrate and create melanocytes that create melanin that leads to coloration in the pelage. So the white spot, the whole story of the foxes is it isn't adaptive. It's an accident of the selection for friendliness. And friendliness just has all these accidental byproducts that are linked genetically through development. And so it's called the star mutation, the white spot on the forehead. That is just a signature of selection of friendliness, but it's not an adaptation.
Great. And we have a science teacher in New Hampshire who's currently teaching their remote classes, and their last unit is evolution. They introduced the unit with the domestication of the wolf. Can you offer more information on the biochemistry or endocrinology evolution for the selection for friendliness?
Well, yes. I'm not sure where to start there, but basically, when you select for friendliness, the universal change that occurs, almost every species that's been studied experimentally, you'll have an increase in serotonin, and you'll have a change in development that goes along with that. And usually the leading hypothesis is that this neural crest cell pathway is altered. And then that leads to the cascading effect throughout the body where these different these pluripotent stem cells migrate at a different rate and lead to all the changes in face morphology or skin color or pelage color, cartilage is softer, etc.
You wrote a book that was incredibly successful, The Genius of Dog. And so maybe the professor can find the book. When you said there's other question, I think I have it on my desk so I can show you.
Yes.
Okay. And you can have all these long, complicated names of the different hormones.
Yeah, and speaking of that, do have questions, Brian, just for more information about your new book. that's coming out. Do you have I know we've talked about it, mentioned it a lot. Do you have a quick promotional elevator pitch for it, or can you tell us when we can purchase that and where?
It is out July 15th, and you can pre-order it now anywhere you can buy books. It's at your independent bookstore, or if you're an Amazon person, wherever you can find books, you'll be able to find Survival of the Friendliest. It'll be electronic. There's going to be an audio version, and it's July 15th. The quick pitch is it's a book.
This is the old book. See, Brian, I have all my notes. And this is the new one. But this one is also the one that you speak a lot about, the domestication of the wolf and the self-domestication of the wolf becoming the dog.
Wonderful. And then, Isabella, I think this is a fun question to end on. Do you have a favorite animal to portray in your videos? Was there one that sticks out?
For the people that don't know, I worked as a model, as an actress, but I always loved animals. And so when I always wanted to study animal behavior, but when I was young in Italy, it wasn't really a discipline that was offered. It was biology, zoology, and I was intimidated by science like a lot of women, and I wasn't a very good student at all. I thought about studying agriculture, but at the time everybody was leaving the farms in Italy and doing more of industrial farming. So the idea of the farm of having my 20 cows and my 30 pigs wasn't valid. Now it's come back with the organic food movement. And so I just stayed in the family tradition and being an actress and a model. And then when I start working less as an actress and a model because they want us young and I'm not young anymore, I went back to university because meanwhile, the animal studies and animal behavior was offered at the university. And so I finished only about a year and a half ago, my master degree. Thank you. It was so interesting. And I am so grateful to myself because at first I was a little shy about going back to university. But to do something just for the sake of curiosity, I don't have to monetize what I do. I don't have to make a career. It's just curiosity. It was a fantastic journey. And I didn't expect, maybe I'm a storyteller and I couldn't help myself but start making short videos, not thinking that we're going to be ever any success. But I started making them for the Sundance Channel, and they became very successful. They got many, many millions of hits. And little by little, it opened for me another career where I combined my fashion skills, because I make all this costume and transform myself into an animal, my fashion skill, my acting skills, or filmmakers, with the science that I've learned. And I always loved laughing, and so I tried to make them as comical as I could. I don't have a favorite animal. Sometimes there is a film that I favor over another film because it's funnier or the costume turned out to be. The one that I hated the most, it was to play the worm. Because in the worm, I put myself in a pink wrap that was, 20 feet long. And I was like this all day, and I just couldn't even scratch my face or drink. I had somebody bringing water. It's a nice video, the earthworm, but it was the hardest to shoot because the costume was so difficult. But I would like to show you one of my last videos. I did a series called Mamas. Scientists, mostly women scientists, asked themselves, we all know, well, we think we know what it is, maternal instinct. But if you look at it very close by, we don't really know what it is. It is an assumption that a female is more ready to give herself, more ready to sacrifice for their little ones. And some of these feminist scientists got worried about it because he said, does it mean that women are more inclined to self-sacrifice, to give themselves for the others? That's good for us. So let's see if it really is true in nature. And they went and they saw an incredible variety. There are mothers that eat their babies. There are babies that eat the mothers. There is an incredible variety. And the biodiversity, it is fascinating because there are millions of ways to solve problems, whether it's mating, whether it's courting, whether it's to be a mother. But so this one is from the series Mama, and I chose is Prunella modularis, a little bird. And I chose it because today I know that with Brian we're going to talk about bonobos. And this little bird may not be as promiscuous as the bonobos, but she does have many husbands, as I call them. And I always thought it could be a very good idea. So here's my video about Prunella modularis. There is Prunella.
What a way to end our evening. Isabella and Brian, thank you for giving your time and being here with us tonight. I know that
James, thank you for asking us. It's wonderful.
We hope to have you both back on site at the museum in the near future. We have to celebrate Brian's book and so much more. So we thank you again. Thank you to everyone out there watching. We hope you enjoyed yourselves. Please check out the rest of our programming. I want to thank again our friends at the Lowell Institute for their support and for making tonight possible. And once again, if you are able to, please go to mos.org/Science Matters and show your support for programming just like this and allow us to keep it going. That's mos.org/Science Matters. Thank you all again. Have a wonderful, wonderful night.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.